This is a podcast about the hardcore community.
Made by and for those who live authentic lives and embrace hard truths.
We archive the stories of the bands and people who make this lifestyle possible. I'm Josh Lyon.
And I'm Greg Benoit.
And this is the Hardcore Archive Podcast. All right, welcome to another episode of the Hardcore Archive Podcast. I'm Josh Lyons. Greg Benoit might be joining us later. We'll see how that goes. Our guest tonight is going to be Andy Thorp King. I think a lot of people who listen to this will probably be familiar with Thorp Records, and the people watching YouTube see he just held up his book that we're definitely going to be talking a lot about tonight, Failure Rules, which has a lot of good references for hardcore and punk in it too. So we'll definitely be I wouldn't be surprised if we're just kind of mixing it up throughout the interview and just talking about both, which I'm totally fine with that. So with all that being said, how you doing tonight, Andy?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me on, Josh. Appreciate it.
No, thank you. Like I told you before we started setting up the interview, I had realized you put the book out, and then a couple times we've had like random publicists hit us up for interviews and stuff. It doesn't happen all that often, but I was like, not to kind of like sidestep your guy, but I was like, I think I kind of already know who this dude is. So I'm just gonna hit him up and be like, we should do this, So I was glad we made it all work out and everything though, man. So
yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, like we were talking about, I'm sure we're going to be talking about the book a lot. I know you make a lot of references to like your life and hardcore throughout. So I'm sure if we talk about like the timeline that I kind of have set up for the interview, I'm sure the book will come up throughout that. And then anything we'll miss with the book, we can just kind of jump into towards the end. You know what I mean?
That all works for me.
Cool. So obviously, as you know, this is like a hardcore podcast, and I know you have some familiarity with hardcore and punk. I'm sure I'd like to dive into Thorp a little bit in a second there. But one thing I am kind of curious about, just like kind of tell everybody like how you got into hardcore and punk and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I think I was probably like in middle school, and I mean, ever since I was like in elementary school, I was like, right out of the chute, like into music, into like rock, into like, I was in like third grade and like going to school with like a jean jacket with like a Black Sabbath patch on it and like a Jimi Hendrix patch, like classic rock, Zeppelin, whatever it was, and wearing like a chain wallet when I was like 8, you know what I mean? So I was always into music, like pretty much from the get-go, and kind of always into getting into trouble too, and then I think it was probably in middle school, like I was still into like classic rock, was hanging out with older kids and shit, and got into like smoking pot and smoking cigarettes and causing trouble after school and all that stuff. And then it was probably like 7th grade, because I was really into BMX bikes. I was really into BMX freestyle, hanging out with all the skaters. And they started introducing me to hardcore and punk. And as soon as I heard like, the Ruin was a band from Philly that I heard and went to see them. And back then it was like Dead Milkman and Why Die and all these local Philly bands. And then I heard Murphy's Law on a cassette tape, Black Flag and Sex Pistols and, all that stuff. And I was just like, this is the music that like resonates with my spirit. This is my energy. That other stuff was like teasing around at it. You know what I mean? It was like a precursor. But once I heard, really, I just remember hearing Murphy's Law, a self-titled album on a cassette. And I had this friend, Keith Sampson, who's since passed away, and he used to skate around in fucking combat boots, and he's like, you got to listen to this here. And so, years later, when I was in a band, 2 Minutes 8, we got to open up for Murphy's Law. It was like kind of surreal at that point, meeting Jimmy and all that.
Yeah, it's nice when that kind of shit always comes full circle. And I was hoping that you would start diving right into the bands and kind of give people a feel for the era, because I know you mentioned the chain wallet thing, and ever since like 95 and past, I feel like chain wallets are more acceptable. But the era you're talking about is when this was kind of more of like the fringe of society, and even the tattoos. Yeah. Like, I'm born in the early 80s, so I'm kind of like a 90s kid. You know what I mean? So I feel like I saw like my generation was the one that kind of really made it, like, because now obviously everybody has tattoos. You know what I mean? Like,
nothing. I mean, it means something to the individual, but it doesn't.
Yeah,
it doesn't add to it really. Yeah.
I know you have a chapter in your book that we'll get to where you talk about like somebody who had piercings and tattoos in the mid 90s even, and they were kind of an outcast. So I kind of remember like, again, just kind of getting into the chain wall thing. I just want to like set the timeline so people are like not thinking that we're talking about like, this era where it's like.
I was mentioning pre-hardcore days when I was like literally like in 3rd grade. So like this would have been like, I don't know, like 83, 84.
Yeah.
I was like more like mirroring like a biker look than anything else, just before I knew what punk and hardcore was. Just to illustrate that I was kind of always into like kind of a rebellious rock and roll type vibe
Yeah.
culture. I mean, and it just naturally gravitated into hardcore punk because to me that was just the epitome, the extreme of like individual expression and positive rebellion.
So, like I told you, getting set up for the interview, I know we could turn you just talking to you about hardcore and Thorp into a full interview. But so I do want to try to move along when we can. But I have a few more questions about this because this is something that we haven't really had too many people from the Philly area, if any, on this podcast. And one thing I'm curious about is then, did you like basically witness like the like origins of hardcore in Philly then pretty much?
I don't know that I would say that, but I mean, it was like back, but when I first started getting into it, it was like, it was bands like Dead Milkman, like punk rock stuff, and bands like Why Die, and there was a little bit of a small, vibrant, very very localized scene, and there was I remember my first show was at the Revival in 1989, seeing the Bad Brains with Leeway opening up, and this band Throttle, who knows who the hell they are, and it was like I remember going there, and like I'm in ninth grade, and it's just like blew my mind, and from then on, I was going to shows, and and then through like the 90s. Going to shows at the First Unitarian Church and 22nd and Chestnut. I remember seeing like Joe Hardcore from This Is Hardcore, like seeing him in the pit when he was like 16 with ponytail, wearing a Rancid shirt, and like, so kind of like grew up seeing that evolution of him and his hyper involvement in the scene, all the impact he's had, seeing him over the years, and other just local Philly dudes. So, it's like going back to those shows now. I don't really keep in touch with a lot of those people on a regular basis outside of some social media, but, you go back there and it's like, we're all in our 40s or I'm almost 50 and like 25, 30 years. It's like, yep, we come back here. We don't have to say much, a head nod. And there's like this understanding, this appreciation of the continuity of the fucking tribe. You know what I mean? And it's like, you just know, like, yeah, we've been through all life changes, whatever, married, divorced, kids, no kids, in and out of whatever type of life trajectory, but you're always anchored back to like the vitality and the necessity of going to a show and getting that like that electric moment.
Yeah, I agree on the tribal energy for sure. Even doing this podcast, I don't get to as many shows as I'd like because like when I was telling you before the interview, I have two really young kids, so it's hard for me to get out at the hours when shows occur a lot of the time. But I did make it out when Buried Alive played here last month. And
nice.
It was just one of those feelings, though. You know what I mean? You get to a show and you see all your old friends. You haven't talked to them in a little while. A lot of us have like differences for petty bullshit over social media in this day and age. But once you get to that show, all that shit is at the door. You know what I mean? Like we're all hugging each other, saying what's up. Like nobody cares about any differences. Like we're all a part of it's a family. You know what I mean? And
it is.
And it's something that I've described it to a lot of people, and like I've been a part of a few other like cultures and scenes, and like there's like the hippie movement's kind of like that, but not really. You know what I mean? Like there's other like community aspects and other scenes, but I don't think you find anything like you find in hardcore. You know what I mean? So, and it's always nice to talk to somebody who agrees on like that tribal energy. You know what I mean? So
yeah, it's unique. It's unique. It's very hard to replicate. The closest approximation I've seen to it is really just in cigar culture and cigar lounges. But it's very unique.
And one thing that I noticed with reading the book, and I do want to be forward with you too. When I told you I was halfway through today, I realized I had thought that there was like 22 or 23 audio files on your book, and there's actually like 75 or 80. So at this point in our conversation, I'm actually halfway through. I was gonna try and skim through the last chapter, but I was like, I kind of want to finish it all the way through after this discussion because I like the way you mix in like pop culture and hardcore and a lot of stuff we're talking about right now. You know what I mean? It's like if I go like there was a book, I forget what the name of it was, but there was like a self-help like book about like starting your own business that my friend Dave had suggested to me a few years ago, and like I read it and I liked it, but like it didn't really speak to me. And like a book like yours where it's like talking about our culture and our people or our tribe, for lack of a better word, you know what I mean? It's like it more speaks to me. So but one thing I did notice though when I was starting to read the book though, going back to that, is that I think you and I have worn many hats and had many jobs in our lives. So as you were kind of like young and finding your way in hardcore and punk, is that when it all started? When you kind of started like working different jobs and kind of taken different trajectories, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think like, the individualism that is representative in just being into hardcore, being into punk was like, to me, it was like synonymous also with like the entrepreneurial spirit. It was synonymous with wanting to do your own thing, DIY, right? So it's like I had that in me. And I also had, another spirit in me, which was, I think, very much what I get out of hardcore and punk, which is striving for the highest meaning in everything you do, right? I mean, hardcore and punk, particularly hardcore, I mean, more than punk even, obviously, is really more centered around like this search for trying to apply meaning to what you do, to life in general. I mean, you think of the hardcore bands, they weren't just complaining about shit, they were also trying to find solutions, or they were looking internally, introspectively, or whether it's, or it might be like to a religion. It could be the Hare Krishna stuff, or it could be straight edge, which is, non-religious, but very, ideological and very, positive and optimistic. So it's like this search to try to marry meaning with occupation, to me also aligned with my hardcore side and with entrepreneurial side. But yeah, I mean, there was always like hardcore was always a soundtrack to like my major decisions, a soundtrack to like the different experiences I had in different jobs or different pursuits, whether it was working as a union steel worker or counseling juvenile delinquents, or working in finance, or starting the record labels, or doing a bodybuilding competition, or writing a spy novel. Like hardcore was always in the background as kind of this motivating, sonic, backdrop.
I'm glad you mentioned the working with like troubled youth and juvenile thing too, because that's one thing that kind of spoke to me in the book, because like I come from like a lower income family, and like I was on the cusp of being in a situation like that, for one, and for two, like I know Philly's always kind of had a reputation for having like crime and stuff like that, and I know like nationwide that issue has kind of gotten worse in the last few years. So
Yes.
I feel like something like that, like I'm glad you had the opportunity to do that before, and like I feel like those kind of jobs are needed, especially right now, because I can't imagine being a teenager or like any of that age in the last 3 or 4 years. You know what I mean? Like all the different things that they've had to like go through and live through as that age. You know what I mean? Like while your body and your emotions are all like going through this growth too. It's like, and your hormones, like I can't imagine
Yeah.
trying to make sense of all this, you know what I mean? And now we have all these weird like TikTok challenge crimes going on here. I don't know if that happened there or not, where like kids are literally just like stealing cars and shit.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, I know we can just like put the blame on the parents and this and that, but I feel like it's a bigger thing. It's not just like a blanket situation like that. And like when I heard you had worked with troubled youth before, I know it was many years ago, obviously, you know what I mean? But it just
Yeah.
makes me think about today and all the different things that are going on in society right now, you know?
Yeah, I mean, when I made that decision, it was really like this kind of gut instinct. I talk in my book about an internal spirit voice, which is what I believe this voice that we kind of all have. That if we're paying attention to it, we hear it within us. You can, debate the origin of that voice, but I think we all have it. We can call it our conscious, we can call it intuition, we can call it following our heart, whatever. We can call it just, our own, crystallized like clarity of direction. But I heard that, and I literally like quit a job I had started in finance to sell mutual funds, which could have been very lucrative, because I just felt like I needed to do something with more meaning. And I found my way in counseling juvenile delinquents as they got out of lockup, as they're integrating back into the communities and checking on them and that type of thing. And it was very meaningful. I mean, I was in and out of trailer parks and ghettos, and there were some dangerous situations and some wild things I witnessed, but I think there was some impact that was had there, and certainly changed me as well. I only did it for about a year because it was very taxing, and it wasn't very lucrative, but it was a very meaningful year. It was an important part of my work-life tapestry. Now being a father, and my kids are a little older, my son is 22, and you're right, the last 3 years has been an absolute fucking disaster. I think particularly for young men. My daughters are faring much better; they're doing very well. And my son, he's struggling with a lot. I mean, everything from he's very into rap culture. He's also, there's some crossover into hardcore, like he likes Turnstile and stuff like that. But generally he's into more like the SoundCloud rap and all of that. But swept up with the anxiety, the depression, the social media influence, drugs, all of that stuff. And we have a lot of very open, deep sometimes very difficult conversations about that. But the challenges, I think, are much more complex than anything we had to contend with. When you have the world in your pocket and you have all the opportunity of the world and also all of the dangers and confusion of the world in your pocket, just beckoning to get your attention at every fucking minute. I can't imagine having that when I was 22. I was already distracted enough and confused enough.
It's funny you mentioned that because I was just thinking that the other day. I was like, I'm not even going to mention the name of the website or the social media thing that is available now that wasn't available back then. But I was like, oh my God, if that was around when I was 21 or 22, like I would not be doing this podcast right now. I don't even know where I would be, but I like there's
Yeah.
just I'm glad things weren't the way they were. Like I said, I'm born in the early 80s, so like I kind of like was coming of age when like MySpace and all that
Yeah.
crap like first started
Right.
becoming popular. And I thought it was all like just kind of a joke at first. I was like, what the fuck is all this crap? Like in retrospect, I'm like, I feel like I'm always a little bit behind on like the technology where I could like some people like really took advantage of that shit and like pushed whatever brands or crap they were doing, and now I'm like, we're doing this podcast and all that
Yeah.
stuff, and at first I was like, this is just like for like teeny boppers to like post pictures of themselves in the mirror or whatever, I didn't realize like the cultural significance of social
Yes.
media, which I mean, if you use it the right way, you know what I mean? Like you can do a lot with it, I feel like.
I mean, it's a tool that magnifies whatever your intent is. I mean, if your intent is positive, your intent is to build, to inform, to connect, then it's great. If your intent is to distract, to deceive, to pollute, then it's also great if that's your intent. I mean, it's just a strong tool, right? So it's a magnification of whatever one's intent is, which I think also is the same power money has, but. Yeah, but it's the power and the reach and the scale of such a tool that's just so now ubiquitous to living in society.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess kind of trying, like I said, I know we're going to be going off on these tangents a lot in this conversation. I already kind of see that coming. I listened to a few of your interviews, and after reading your book, like I have an
Yeah,
outline, like I said, and I'm glad to talk about all this stuff eventually. But I'm also,
yeah,
I'm glad we're able to talk about this other stuff too. But so I guess one thing I'm curious about though, with like you working in the music industry and stuff like that, is like I think it kind of goes back to like what we were talking about before with like kind of like a DIY culture and stuff like that. And I feel like that's something that you I don't know if you openly address it in the book, but it is something that kind of is something I take from the book. You know what I mean? So like when like with you being involved in hardcore and punk, like I know you didn't start Thorp until years later, but like did you have an idea, like a seed planted in your mind, like younger, that you wanted to do stuff like that? Or was it like that came later, like working with Relapse and stuff like that?
well, I always had that kind of like ingenuity and that kind of spark. Like even like I said, when I was into like BMX and skateboarding culture, punk rock as a young kid, I did zines, man. Like I had the zine Shredders mag, and I was like interviewing bands and local skaters and BMXers and stuff like that, and was just always like, enthusiastic about whatever I was into, right? So as I graduated college and I decided to not take my teaching certificate and drop out of student teaching and just take an English lit degree, I mean, the world was wide open. And so I just continued working at a steel plant that I worked at during college and kind of did that union life and learned a lot, from that experience, kind of learning Spanglish and just be, kind of learning the working class life there. Competed for a bodybuilding show while I was doing that. And that was immensely, meaningful. But at that whole time, I was just super into hardcore, going to a lot of shows in Philly, Troc, your First Unitarian Church, all of that. And my passion for that just continued to grow. So at some point I was like, how do I lean into this? How do I get into this world? What's my foothold into this world? And I started writing for music magazines. I was writing for what was back in the day Rock Pile and Chord magazines, which I think were more regional in the Philly area or East Coast. Chord was more national. That was also Met from Too Damn Hype Records. And, and he was a local Philly guy. So like I knew him. So I ended up going to shadow him and learn how he did his label. And I just ate it all up, and just kind of like, for free. It was just like being his mentee. And he's a great dude. Saw him recently. But, a lot of what I learned from him was kind of clumsy, probably bad advice, but it was a great start. You know what I mean? And from there, that's when I ended up getting kind of providentially, I think, after working, after getting laid off from a job at Ford Credit, being a bill collector, I ended up meeting the vice president of Relapse Records at the gym one night. saw this dude in a Snapcase shirt, and I wasn't really even into Snapcase, but I was like, well, that's interesting. You know, you don't see that often in the meathead gym in a Philly suburb. You know, went up, struck up a conversation, and you know, found out he was a VP for Relapse. He was an attorney previously. He quit it to do something he loved. He moved from Colorado, and we followed up on emails within a few weeks and had several interviews. Ended up landing the job running their wholesale department, and that was like the beginning of like this paid education, the music industry, which went hand in hand with the label I had just started. I'd signed Breakdown, the classic New York hardcore band, and did their first record after, you know, driving to New York, doing a deal with them, meeting with them. It was cool, sang gang vocals, you know, in the studio, meeting AJ from Leeway and Mike DeJean and Jeff Perlin and all those guys. And now I was getting this, you know, window into the industry. So I worked at Relapse for several years before I then moved to Ohio, worked for Lumberjack Distribution, you know, which was the exclusive distributor for like Bridge 9 Records, Death Wish, Trustkill, Ferret, Eyeball, all kinds of other labels, and worked in all the initial, you know, retail and ad campaigns for a lot of those bands that came through those labels. I mean, even like more mainstream stuff like All American Rejects. I remember the owner of Lumberjack, who also owned Doghouse Records, Dirk Hemsath. His sister-in-law was like 17 at the time. She's in the warehouse and going through demos that came into Doghouse, and All American Rejects was one of them. And she was the one who pulled out, like, hey, you ought to listen to this. Next thing you know, they're flying in, hanging out in the warehouse, and he signed them to a deal and sold them off to Warner, and they became this huge band, right? But I remember when like nobody knew who they were, and they were just hanging out in the warehouse, and like, you know, and it was just a cool place to be, both Relapse and Lumberjack. Seeing the bands travel through, like Relapse, Mastodon used to hang out in the office all the time, Dillinger Escape Plan, you know, whoever, you know, and then you know, I remember meeting Pete from Benum there, and then in Lumberjack, like I worked with Mike Gayton, who was he was in Premonitions of War. He became a good friend. I actually slept on his floor at his place for months before I was able to fully relocate out to Ohio. He also then played in Ramallah, who I did a record for, you know, with White Trash Rob, and also Jeff from Cold as Life. And it was just between both those experiences, those jobs, just met so many cool people, intersected with so many different, not just hardcore, but, you know, all the different subgenres, you know, like became friends with Andrew from Against Me, who used to work at Lumberjack, and just everybody was doing something. They either were in a band or they had a label, anybody who worked anywhere, like Gordon Conrad from Escape Artist worked at Relapse, and Drew, who now runs Translation Loss Records, which did the new All Out War record. He worked at Relapse back then. I haven't talked to many of these people in like years, but you know, that was like the foundation. It was just so vibrant, so fucking vibrant. And so that really fed into like, you know, helping me to kind of build and grow the labels and learn the business side the best I could, as crazy and chaotic as it was.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Mike from Premonitions of War. He was always a really solid dude. And like I told you, I know I at least put it in the show notes, or the outline for this. I ran a small label around that time too, named Enterprise, the same as the hardcore shit that I do.
Okay.
And Mike, and I think it was like 2003 where Mike helped get like 6 or 7 smaller labels, like exclusive distribution through Lumberjack, like Hex Records, and mine was one of them.
Yeah, okay.
And so I was always thankful for that. Yeah, because I was like
the name actually, because it was always, you know, we had the list of labels. I mean, I was the salesman. He was in purchasing.
Yeah,
his office was right next to mine. Yeah.
And that was like the tail end of me doing the label, because like I'm not going to get into that because that's like a whole episode in and of itself. But like the last record I put out was this band Roses Are Red, and they ended up signing to Trustkill. So that CD did pretty well. Yeah, it did pretty well through Lumberjack, and they kept getting more and more. And I was like, man, this is fucking awesome, you know? And so I was always thankful to Mike, because he was the one that set that up. Like he just shot me an email one day. It was like, we're doing this exclusive thing. And I was like, say no more. You know what I mean? Like once you hear the word exclusive, if you're a label, and I feel like, and you're smart about it, you're going to be like, okay, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I don't know how it would work now. Like, because I have no idea how like distribution and everything works in the digital age.
But back then it was everything.
Yeah, because they got your shit everywhere too. Like they mailed me back like some of the smaller releases that I did, but like I said with that Rose the Red band, it was like they were just always ordering like a couple boxes of CDs, and I was like, all right, this is.
I remember keying the orders in. I was the guy keying the orders in. And,
oh yeah, because you were the wholesale guy. You did the wholesale shit there too.
Yeah, and I was the one calling all the shops, and I would go through all our exclusive stuff. Oh, you missed this, you got to pick up this, and I was pushing the exclusive stuff, and would set up the retail programs, whether it was like end caps or listening stations or whatever else. You know,
That was like my one air. I was like that was like when hardcore was like really blowing up too, and I was trying to like get the label more serious. So like they had the glossy thing for Lumberjack the 1 month, and I put an ad
Yep.
in alternative press. You know what I mean?
Yep.
I was like, this could really pop off, but then I was just like, I don't know.
Yep.
Like I said, that's a whole episode of like things that happen after that, and I was just like, kind of, I'm gonna start the label up again eventually, hopefully, put it that way, you know.
Yeah.
So,
That was the
but
world back then, though. Everything you just mentioned, like getting the full page glossy,
mhm.
ad in the mail, or like that was a big deal. That meant a lot. And the alternative press. I mean, the model's totally changed. It's all
Yeah,
digital now, none of that, and it's
yeah.
more D2C, direct to consumer. But
But
back
now,
then, that stuff was important. Those gatekeeping,
yeah.
thresholds.
I want to stick to Thorp just for a second because this is one of the things that Greg wanted me to talk to you, ask you about too. But I also myself too, like you already mentioned, the first release was Breakdown, and I'm like I ran a small hardcore label, you know what I mean? Like I put out a couple local bands and like a couple like youth group bands from here and there, but like you right out of the gate, like you put out a fucking Breakdown record, and then I was looking through because I remember you putting the Madball thing out a few years later, but
Yeah.
like you had all these European hardcore bands that for the most part hadn't really had much traction in the US, you know what I mean? Like how did you know all these people already, or were you just like cold emailing people and like I'm doing this label now and like I want to like help you guys out type thing? Or
I mean, they all came from different sources in the beginning. I mean, Breakdown met from Too Damn Hype Chord Recordings. It was like he was who I was shadowing to start my label. He was like, "Oh, Breakdown wants to do a record. You can talk to them." I'm like, "Fuck it, yeah, I love Breakdown." And it was just right from him. And I dumped a shit ton of money into it, man. I mean, I literally maxed out my credit cards while I was unemployed to start a record label. Totally insane. But you know what? Here I am 20 something years later and, put out over 100 records between the two labels. So, yes, lots of turbulence, lots of hard times, but I put my balls on the table from the get go. Like I was, probably a little bit of a naive risk taker. But once you get going, then you just find ways to keep going, you know what I mean? The best you can. And so, yeah, it was Breakdown. And then the European hardcore bands like Stamping Ground, Riker, shit like that. How did that come about? I mean, again, it was connections through Matt, and then I met like Anno Chromag in Europe, who was doing A&R for Ice Cream Records. So we would just partner up on deals. Like I'd license a Euro record here, he'd license shit over there to help, kind of like help out with the financing to sign bigger bands. So like if I didn't have all the money to go sign a Madball record or a Blood for Blood record or Slapshot record or whatever, partner up with them and they chip in on the advance for the European territory. Then I do the same in Japan, do the same in Australia. Then I get extra money by licensing out vinyl in different territories and just chop up the pie so much where, yeah, I was diluting my rights, but it enabled me to get these bands. And mostly it was North America that really mattered to me from a reputation building standpoint.
see, I never knew any of this shit like coming up. Like I mean I talked to like a few regional people and like I would see the way other people did it, but like you having the experience of like shadowing somebody because I mean Too Damn Hype, he put out some solid shit and Chord, like you said, that was a solid magazine. Like you said, it wasn't just
Oh, yeah.
regional because we got that up here. I had a few of those, and but I'm saying like you talking about like the European rights and licensing and shit like that. Like I never would have even thought about half that. Like I was just trading records with European labels. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
here's 20 of whatever I have for 20 of whatever you have, and imagine paying the shipping on that now to try and trade somebody 20 records overseas, and then they have to wait fucking 8 weeks to get it or whatever now too. It's like it's just crazy to think about how like I don't want to say we had it easy back then because I feel like they like we could say they have it easy now too, obviously, like how quickly you can release something digitally, but like I don't know the vinyl aspect of it and the CD aspect of it, like it seems like
It
it
was
was like
actually harder back then for labels in a lot of ways, in the sense that there was more risk and you had less of a window to actually get your stuff in front of people, right? I mean, the latency on putting an ad in a magazine and actually having it hit the streets and get in front of eyeballs, the short shelf life of getting something on the shelf, particularly if it's like a big box store, and then having a return. And then not only are you losing money because you're having a negative charge to your account, but then they also charge you a fee for the return. And you're paying for all the shipping back and forth and all the shit. Like the risk was just so heavy and the margin was just so low. I mean, it was absolutely an insane labor of love, right? I mean, it was just insane. But then, sometimes things worked out. I mean, the reality is it was much like an insurance pool, right? I mean, like you only need a small percentage of the records to hit to pay for all the ones that you were, that didn't, right? And, over time, that's how it all works out and flattens out.
Now, and this is something that Greg had sent me about the label too. Like I already had kind of written down some bands that I remembered. You mentioned half of them, like Breakdown, Northside King,
Oh
Striking
yeah,
Distance. And then Greg
striking this.
even
Yep.
like I noticed a couple of these too, but then Greg starts mentioning like For Dire Life's Sake and like you
Yeah,
mentioned
yeah, yeah.
Premonitions of War. So like we're going into like pretty diverse territory at this point. You know
Fuck
what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Like
Yep, yep.
so like was this something that you had thought of in the beginning to kind of make it more diverse, or was that as you were kind of chugging along, you realized like I could put out more and more if I diversified it type thing, or
It was the latter, and I'm not sure it was really the best move, although it made it interesting, right? I think it was because I was getting exposed to a lot more types of stuff working at Relapse and working at Lumberjack. The guys from For Dire Life's Sake, they were friends with the guy I was friends with at Lumberjack. They were from Detroit, met those guys, went and saw them play live. They were really killing it. Wasn't really my thing, but they were so good at it. And they were cool guys. I was like, let's do this. That ended up selling like 2,000 copies just through Hot Topic. You know what I mean? Like that was a pretty big record for me. And then like Premonitions of Wars because I was friends with Mike, and I wasn't really a metal guy, but we were friends. So we did that. And that was a split with Benam. I met Pete from Benam from Relapse. So a lot of it was like being friends with dudes in bands where even though it wasn't my style, they were cool. Their band was good, even if it wasn't my thing. And it diversified the label. And they're like, hey, you want to do something? Like, sure, let's do it, And, on the one hand, you could say that's like diluting your brand or straying away from what you love. But I mean, when it comes down to like friendship and wanting to support people that you think are doing cool things, even if it's not totally like your favorite type of music, I didn't mind doing it, But it did kind of like, because, Thorp was viewed more as like a traditional hardcore label up until those diversions, It was more New York style hardcore, even if bands weren't from New York. But yeah, so then that stuff started happening. And then my true love at that point really was like New York hardcore style stuff, old fast hardcore, youth crew stuff, even though I was no longer straight edge. And then really loved like street punk, oi, psychobilly. And that's when I started Sailor's Grave to just totally focus on those genres and kind of lump them together. And that really was a cohesive niche label that really had a little more power over time. It was more concentrated, and still doing really, really well today with bands like Coffin Cats, Flatfoot 56, the Goddamn Gallows, who I still talk to and work with as they're on the road.
do you still like repress anything, or is it all pretty much digital at this point, or like off
Well,
of either of
it's
the
mostly
labels, I guess?
digital, but I do repress some stuff. Like,
Yeah.
just saw the Coffin Cats play in Delaware a couple of weeks ago, and they're like, dude, we need more vinyl. So, I'm going to be pressing some more vinyl from them real soon. And, but yeah, I mean, it's vinyl. It's vinyl selling on the road. CDs sell on the road actually too, strangely for some of these older bands, but it's vinyl and digital,
Yeah.
and specifically streaming, not downloads.
Yeah, it's weird because you mentioned the New York hardcore and traditional style, like that was kind of like your signature, even though you didn't release all that stuff. Like that's like what I'm most known for liking. Like that's my favorite style of hardcore. But
Yeah,
like if
me
you look
too.
at when I have my label, I probably had like 12 releases total, and I would say maybe 2 of them were that style. You know what I mean? Like everything else was
Right.
like, because it was like I wasn't like trying to do it full time, but I also was like looking at it like a business too. You know what I mean? Like I know these records are going to do well. You know what I mean? Like the band that ended up signing to Trustkill kind of came to me, and I
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of knew it was like you release our CD as like a launching pad for us type thing, and then we'll get signed to another label. And I was like, if that happens, like the CD is going to be in print forever type thing. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
not really knowing that CDs would go away like
You
3
still
years
have the
after
rights to
that.
that today? The Roses are Red. You still in the rights to that, or is that revert back?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about reissuing. We haven't talked about any vinyl for it, but their singer put it out on digital last year. I am going to start my label back up, but I don't know if I'm going to like call it Enterprise again or call it something else. I've always wondered because I know Lumberjack's gone, so I don't know if
Oh
with
yeah,
anything would have any. There wouldn't there nothing would matter there, right? With having signed stuff with them 20 years ago or
hell no,
whatever.
hell no, no.
So because that was my one thing, I was like, I don't know if I should still call it that. But other than that, I think I probably could just call it that. And they're one of the bands that I was like, it'd be cool to put this out on vinyl because it never was on vinyl. But I
Yeah,
like all these bands from 20 years ago, like it's usually like one member of the band wants to do it, and the rest of them are just kind of like, would anybody care? You know what I mean?
right,
Like,
right.
because I'm not
You
gonna name
moved
the
on.
name. I'm not gonna name the name, but there's another band on my label that I was like trying to do that with recently, and I kind of realized that like I don't think they really want to do it. It was just kind of like I was excited about it, and like other people were, and like maybe one dude from the band was, and I was like, it's more of like a nostalgia vibe at times, I feel like, and other people might not feel the same way. And it's just like
Yeah,
maybe things are better to be left in that era for now, you know what I mean? And see in a couple more years if people feel more nostalgic for it, I guess, you
yeah.
know. Um So I guess kind of getting more towards the book. One thing I was curious about is I know how many books have you written? Because I know you've like done like some mystery stuff too, right?
Just two books. So the first book was a
Okay.
spy novel called Blaze Operation Persian Trinity, and it
Okay.
was
I
like,
saw.
yeah.
Okay.
That was
I
the
make
first
I'm
one. So
mixing
one fiction,
mixing.
one nonfiction. Yeah,
Okay, because I saw that on Rev. I just do my Google like looking around to
yeah.
see what I could find for the outline and stuff, and I because I know on your website it said you had written before, so like did you have an interest to be a writer like years ago, or is this something that more you kind of developed an interest in as you got older, or
No, I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, even like I said, I used to write zines when I was younger, and then even like my senior year, I did like these little like kind of poetry journal entry books that were kind of Henry Rollins esque type shit. You know what I mean? And then when I was in college, did the same thing. It's kind of like poetry journal entry things, and I used to do like spoken word gigs around town, and was always kind of into that expressive kind of format. And then it was more long form as I got older. But I think that getting into music and doing the labels was almost like a creative diversion for me, where it was like a business, it was creative, but it wasn't even my art. It was like my vision and things I liked that I was sponsoring, so to speak. But I really always had this expressive impulse, this creative impulse that I needed to really fulfill, and that has really come about through writing and now speaking and everything else that's attached to the book and its message. But yeah, I wrote that first spy novel after like a period of failure, where I pivoted away from the record labels because ran into some turbulence with overinvesting in some records and losing money when Tower Records went under, and the digitization of music happened very quickly. I kind of like shut down the office, laid off the publicist and the part-time help and all of that, and just put the labels kind of on ice for a little bit, let them recoup, and then started doing records again part-time by pursuing other full-time work, and started my own financial planning business. And that was okay for a while until the 2008 crisis hit, right? And clients were pulling money. And it was really at that time where it's like almost like to save myself from depression, I needed a creative outlet. And I was reading a lot of spy novels and really getting into them, like stuff like Daniel Silva and Vince Flynn and Brad Thor and Ted Bell. And I was like, fuck it, I'm a writer. Why don't I start writing a book? And I had the story in my head, and I started writing that in 2007, and starts and stops, and eventually finished it in 2015. And it was around that time, actually, probably 2013, while I was finishing up the spy novel, that I wrote the initial kind of like partial draft of Failure Rules, because I was going through these twin failures in my life at the time of, a marriage breaking down, and a business divorce that I had in the online lending business that was pretty tumultuous. And there was a time where all of a sudden, like, I had no office to go to by day, no family to go home to at night. I was living in a hotel room, and all the ideas for Failure Rules came to me then. It was like I had learned so much through entrepreneurial off-road adventuring and some of the failures and difficulties I encountered, but were very important and very instructive. And I was inspired by so many other kind of virtual mentors that I go through in the book. And I wanted to kind of lay that all out and connect all those dots. A lot of it stemming from like, listening to Motorhead and Cro-Mags on the beach one day and thinking of a Winston Churchill quote: "Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm." And so kind of all those inputs catalyzed, and this book just poured out of me.
now one thing and I'm sure I'm not the first or last person to tell you this, but like the title Failure Rules is obviously very eye-catching, and I feel like it's even kind of ballsy to even call a book that, you know what I mean?
That's right.
Because no one's gonna like I said in the beginning, I've worked a lot of jobs. I don't have like a real career per se. I'm a stay-at-home dad now, so that obviously counts for something, but like
Yeah.
nobody really wants to admit that they've had any sort of failures. Like we were talking about the record labels. I mean, neither one of us like currently is like actively releasing, you know what I mean? Like we don't really want to
Yeah.
admit that
I did
those
it
were
full
both
time for a few years, but yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah.
I never got to the level you did, but like I look at it now as like it could have, that's a side conversation. But like nobody wants to say like I failed at this and that. And then another thing I'm thinking of with you talking about like the hotel and stuff like that is like to kind of put myself out there a little bit, I guess. Like I had an incident a few years ago where I ended up in a car accident, which was due to my drinking, and I had to go through like
Mm,
a couple programs. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
a
yeah.
term that comes up in those is rock bottom. And
Sure.
did this book come out of that pretty much, or like, because it kind of sounds like it, not to get too
Yeah,
personal,
yeah.
you know what I
And
mean?
I
But
wouldn't
like,
say it was like rock bottom from like in a material external sense, right? But it was a position of extreme strength from an internal spiritual sense, right? So it was like, literally, I mean, when I was in that hotel at that time, the world was wide open. The world was scary. Things were falling apart. Things were shifting and things were crumbling, right? And it was like, I always lean on music. I lean on my spirituality, and those two things converged. I remember listening to the song "Divinity of Purpose" by Hatebreed from Jamie Josta, where I'll read it here, where he sings, "I felt the pain of discipline was less than that of regret. Lifted one foot from the grave when the purpose showed its face. And when the skies crashed down upon me, I looked for someone by my side. You were there when no one else was. You showed me what's born doesn't always die, the divinity of purpose," right? And it was like that just spoke to me, gave me fucking buoyed me. I still had this divinity of purpose in me. Like instead of just like sulking and giving up or despairing or wallowing in alcoholism, and I'm no stranger to alcohol, I'm drinking bourbon right now. Instead, I just birthed all these ideas and thought of the adjacent possible and how can I reinvent myself and birth new manifestations of my talents. And 5 things kind of emerged from that period, sitting in that fucking hotel room. I began writing Failure Rules. I finished my spy novel. I ended up doing consulting in the online lending space. One of those partnerships evolved into a proper lead generation company that we started that was very lucrative for a time. I then also got started my career in fintech, financial technology, and got a job in corporate banking, working for the same company I work for today that helps with money movement and creative technology, like with the likes of like PayPal and Chime and companies like that. I work in the innovation lab, and that was like profound because I was coming from essentially the payday loan space to corporate banking. It was like being a porn star and getting a regular acting job. All of a sudden I had to cover up my tattoos and tuck my shirt in, and it was a little different. And then I also reinvested in the record labels at the same time and ended up putting out like Coffee Cats, Booze and Glory, The Creep Show, stuff on Sailor's Grave Records. And so it was like, I used that empty failure space. It was like, all right, I got some chaos, like the chapter of the book, leverage chaos as an idea engine. It can be a threat if it hits you head on, but if you see the chaos coming and you identify it, step out of your emotional mind and get into your objective observer mind, you can take the power and the energy of that chaos and shape it to your advantage. And that's what I did instead of just like lamenting. And that's like one of the lessons of the book. And that's a big lesson of the book is detaching from external material things while still trying to optimize them, but detaching from them, not being attached when they fall or crumble or shift, and then trying to see the newness and the opportunity in chaos and how you can reinvent yourself and try new things and maybe even intersect and marry disparate interests to create new things. I mean, Failure Rules is a great example. I mean, this book literally ties in the strangest like hobbies or interests or philosophies or inputs, right? I mean, you got everybody from Lemmy Kilmister in here to Rabbi Daniel Lapin being quoted, right? You got everything from like, experiences in bodybuilding to writing spy novels to fucking hardcore punk record labels. It's like somehow it all works and goes under this umbrella to create something new. And so that really comes out of the beauty and the opportunity of failure spaces.
yeah, like I said, I like how you were able to turn on to a positive. I feel like if I was in that space, I would just be in such a negative space where it'd be hard for me to turn it around like that. And it's impressive. So one thing I'm curious about though, like, is were you working on it the entire time? Like, because I know you just mentioned starting to work on it basically like around 10 years ago, it sounds like. And I know like while listening to the audio version, they're talking about there's a passage where you're talking about it was either July or August of 2020.
Yeah.
So were you consistently writing like the entire time and just like kind of drafting and doing different things, or was it you would go
It
back
was
and
start
forth?
and stop. Start and stop.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote the initial notes in 2013, wrote like a rough draft in 2014, pivoted away from it to finish the spy novel. Life took hold, and I didn't think I touched it for several years. And then I picked it up again, mostly right before the pandemic. And when the pandemic hit and I was locked inside, man, I would spend 6-7 hours a day drafting, redrafting, adding to it. And that's where that extra content came that was more fresh, that was more, reflective of the pandemic era. Like, 2020, I was living in South Philly, sitting on my balcony, nothing but a fucking robe on, smoking cigars all day, drinking Irish coffee, just banging away at the keyboards, just pouring out like 6,000 fucking words,
I'm not laughing about the pandemic. I'm obviously laughing because so many great ideas were born out of it. It's like you got to basically complete your book. This
Yeah,
podcast, this
yeah,
podcast probably would have started eventually, but it definitely started because of and during that. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like I
yeah,
I said on the last episode that I posted because it started by me posting old flyers, and I posted my very first one on I think it was March 19th of 2020. You know what I mean? Like when my first day home from work or whatever, and
yeah,
I think it was like a week later, somebody was like, when's the podcast start? You know what I mean? And I was just like,
yeah.
all right. Like, and if you look since then, like everybody, like, it's kind of like, it's almost like, I forget what the meme somebody sent to me recently was, but it's like, there's like, it's just going to be like every single person has one now. It seems like a podcast or whatever. So it's like, I'm glad we
It's
got
like an
into it.
email address now. Everybody's got one. Right. Yeah.
Mine really is mine is a podcast, but that's not even what this one's called anymore too. That's the funniest part. So
Mm.
my email address is Enterprise Hardcore Podcast, but we changed the name of the podcast a few months ago. So I'm sure
Yeah.
people get the emails and they're like, what the fuck?
Yeah. Right.
you
Right.
know? So, but yeah, you have like tons of pop culture and hardcore influences in the book, which obviously keeps somebody like me interested. I guess I could ask you a variety of questions with that. Like I'll start with like was there an influence like of other writing that you had seen like that made you want to do it like that, or was it just like you knew it would keep people entertained while reading or listening to the book, I guess?
Well, I think the hardcore punk stuff wasn't that thought out. It was just a true expression of the stuff that spoke to me that literally helped me during a lot of these hard times, and was a reflection of kind of the ethos that is just so deep within me that makes me tick, that I'm wired with, right? What was more intentional was to diversify away from that and add in all the other stuff that was non-hardcore. That was more intentional, still authentic, still genuine, but more intentional, because I was like, oh shit, this is not going to appeal to anybody but hardcore people if all I have is just hardcore stuff and punk stuff all layered throughout. Like this book is actually much more broad than that, so I had to, pull on other non-hardcore punk, influences that I have in my life. Whether it's, podcasters or, philosophy. I mean, it's quoting everything from Aristotle to investor James Altucher to billionaire Sarah Blakely to, to Gene Simmons from Kiss to whatever.
Whatever what's the bowler's name?
Oh yeah, Thomas Smallwood. It's funny you say that. Like that was one of the chapters that so many people seem to really resonate with. Like that was one of the favorite kind of chapters for a lot of people. But yeah, like Thomas Smallwood, man. I mean, that was a great story, and it really mirrored my story in a lot of ways. It was really cool, And then coincidentally, after I'd already written that and included in the book, then I find out that what is it, Pete Holmes, the comedian, ended up starring in a CBS special or sitcom based on Thomas Smallwood's life. But I didn't even know that was coming out, or that it was he was going to be kind of more storied like that. It was just a story that resonated with me and reflected my own to a degree.
At first, I was a little weirded out because I looked it up on IMDb and I was like, "What is Thorp sitting around watching CBS on weeknights or whatever? Like, how does he
The
fucking know
show
about
actually
this guy or
sucks. I
whatever?"
love Pete Holmes, but I can't watch sitcoms.
I saw the IMDb rating and I was like, "He must know more about this story than I do. It must not be referencing the show or whatever." So,
Yeah.
but I'm trying to think here because there was something that Greg had mentioned about the. Oh yeah, so with all the people from punk and hardcore and all the philosophers and historical figures you mentioned in the book, can you pinpoint like one or two that have been most influential to you, like in your life? I know you probably have a lot more than that, but
Yeah, I mean, I think the four that I mentioned that were really like impetuses for me writing the book was Churchill, Lemmy from Motorhead, John Joseph, who wrote The Ford from the Cro-Mags, and the two writers, James Altucher, who wrote Choose Yourself, and Srinivas Rao, who wrote The Art of Being Unmistakable. And Srinivas Rao has now become a friend. He actually coached me on the launch of the book and kind of helped, consult me. So I say, basically I have this in the acknowledgments. It was two rockers, two writers, and a World War II icon, So that's, they were kind of the main impetus.
and that's diverse, like we were saying, obviously. So, and you mentioning the writer kind of walking you through the process a little bit kind of makes me wonder too, like obviously, like to a degree, like like writing, like being a writer is like a completely different world than anything else that we've really talked about on this episode.
Yeah.
Have you kind of like rubbed elbows and like gotten to know any other like writers or anything like that yet, or is that kind of stuff that comes a little later, you think? Or
Yeah, no, that's already starting to happen because I mean, a lot of these podcast hosts are also writers, particularly in the entrepreneur space, the motivation, inspiration space. So a lot of these podcasts I'm going on, they've written books. Their podcast is an extension of the book. They're having me on, and we're getting to know each other. Like Srinivas Rao, now he did a blurb for me. Joshua Coburn, who owns Dissident Cigars, he's also an old punk rocker. You know, he's written books and he's a motivational speaker. He wrote a blurb. Christian Picciolini, who wrote Breaking Hate. He's been on like everything from Sarah Silverman and Anderson Cooper in the media a lot. He was an ex-Nazi skinhead who converted to, got away from that and has an organization where he helps lead people out of hate. And so he wrote a great book. He's become a friend. He also was the manager for Flatfoot 56. That's how I met him. So there's always still connections back to music, but plenty of writers too. And obviously John Joseph writes a lot of books, PMA Effect, among others. So the writing world's a different world. And it's cool because it's very diverse, but it seems like I'm always finding connections back to either hardcore punk or cigar culture, which are two of my favorite loves.
we listened to the audio version of the PMA Effect when we were painting our attic like 10 years ago, and I feel like he skipped some stuff in there because I had heard the acid story before, but I don't think it's in the audio version. And I was kind of
the PMA Effect or
no, Evolution of a Chromagnon. I'm sorry.
Okay,
yeah. Evolution of Chromagnon. We had
very different books. One.
Yeah. No, sorry.
It's more like a mindset self-help book, really.
Yeah. We had listened to that Chromagnon one, and I don't think the acid story outside MSG is on the audio version, which I was kind of like, I always kind of wanted to hear that whole story, so I'll have to find the passage eventually. So I guess like what do you do like you were talking about like doing like speaking and stuff, like do you do like stuff like that like with this and like with the book and stuff like that, and like do you do like what do you call it, like bookstore appearances and stuff too, like signings and stuff?
I haven't done bookstore appearances yet. That might happen at some point. I mean, the reality of these days is really like podcasts has replaced that primarily. So I'm just focusing on media and podcast tour, and I'm doing about 2 to 3 podcasts a week. I've been on, one national TV show, national radio show. Well-known rapper Zuby, he has 1 million Twitter followers, was on his show, and then a bunch of other, smaller, mid-sized. But the cool thing is, like, I'm hitting all these different topics, right? So it's everything from music stuff to cigar podcasts to like entrepreneur podcasts to health and wellness, to mindset. Like the book touches so many things meaningfully, so I can really stretch out and makes all the conversations very interesting, even though they still all intersect to a degree. But yeah, I mean, I will be doing some speaking, and I have offering coaching services. That'll all develop over time. I'm doing some events this year, mostly in the cigar space. I'm actually doing an event Saturday at a Women in Cigars conference, and so I'll be selling books and doing stuff there. Going to the PCA, the Premium Cigar Association, big conference in Vegas this summer. I got a booth there because there's just a lot of intersection there, because a lot of cigar smokers are entrepreneurs. They're interested in this topic, and they'll do events at their lounges and do speaking events there. So it's a strange kind of application, but I'll be probably embedding myself a lot into that world. And then I do have ideas around doing like a punk rock PMA spoken word tour. I've talked to some notable people about that. Nothing is really come to fruition yet, but that's also at some point something I want to do, which I think would be really badass.
That'd be really cool.
You got people like, and these aren't people I've talked to necessarily about this, but you got everybody from John Joseph to this guy Christian Picciolini to like Toby Morse to like this guy Josh Coburn, who's in that world. There's a lot of people who were from the punk hardcore world that have branched out and do motivational speaking type stuff or have written books, and it still circles back to their hardcore roots. So I think it could be a cool thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that like you can always picture, like you can always see a good hardcore frontman would obviously be a good motivational speaker. Like I'm sure if Vogel ever wanted to go that route, it would definitely be there for him. Like, come on, motherfucker.
Come on, Vogel's in the book too. I quote some terror in the beginning of one.
Yeah,
always the hard way. Sure.
I mean, that's the perfect shit to listen to when you're trying to get through anything. You know what I mean? So I'm curious though about the.
Speaking of, there's a soundtrack to the book too. Did you know that?
I did, but
Yeah,
I'm gonna
yeah.
put everything in the show notes too. Is there any links for anything? Or I know there's like music with the audio edition too. Is it like a playlist you have, or is there like a
Yeah, I put
website?
playlists on Failure Rules soundtrack playlist on Spotify and Apple Music. Yeah, I mean it's got everything from Cro-Mags, H2O, Billy Bio, Coffee Cats, Black Flag, Gorilla Biscuits, Terror, Rollins Band, all kinds of bands. But it's
Yeah,
literally the songs that I literally listen to either during some of these hard times or during writing of the book or the reference in the book. So it's truly is like a companion, authentic match to the book. And some people have told me they've listened to it while they've read the book, and that's pretty cool. It's kind of the intent there. So, yeah.
I like in the audio too. You actually start off. I don't. It's some of the sections maybe. I don't know, but there's
Yeah.
music and there's music in there actually and stuff,
You
which
like
is
that?
pretty
Yeah, yeah,
cool.
yeah. Yeah, and that
So
was the verse too. I mean, it's everything from Mad Ball to For Our Life's Sake to U.S. Bombs, who I did a record for at Sailor's Grave Records, and I think Kings of Nothing I use in the audiobook too. Another one of my favorite bands on Sailor's Grave.
oh yes, sidebar and for a second. I am curious about the cigar culture. Is that something that you've been into for like? It sounds like a really long time from you talking about it in the book, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I think 2005 is when I really became like a regular cigar smoker. When I was running labels full time, and I had like part time help in office, but she wasn't there all the time. And then everybody else like kind of worked more remotely, 1099, publicist, web designer, and all that shit, right? And then distributor. So it was like I was alone a lot, and I actually had an office where I could smoke cigars, so I did that in there. But there was like these lounges in the area, and I would just go there and bring my laptop and just really ended up like loving the different people that I met there, lots of different entrepreneurs, creative people. And it was just a great place to fucking work. So I ended up like a couple days a week working at cigar lounges and just became a lover of the leaf. And now my best friend who I've known since kindergarten works for General Cigars. So they rep like Cohiba and Punch and a bunch of other lines. And so he's immersed in that. He pretty much full time is a fucking entertainer, just goes around the cigar lounges, puts on events and, you know, throws parties and sells cigars. And he's introduced me to a lot of cigar personalities. And so like Rick Rodriguez, who owns West Tampa Tobacco Company, used to be a master blender for CAO. Like he did a blurb on the book. I write about him in the book. He's a friend. He's actually doing an event tomorrow night. I'm going to go see him and hang out with him. So yeah, that's become like somewhat like the punk rock scene to me. It's just another awesome scene of like cool people that you just kind of have this like tribal connection to.
Yeah, it's weird. I never knew there was such a community for it, but like kind of digging through your Instagram a little bit and seeing the stuff you post every day, I was like, man, this
Yeah.
is like a real community. I mean, I personally,
Yeah.
I smoke cigars for other purposes. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
we've
That's a
never
good
really used the
experience.
fancy ones. I went to a poker game once in like 2007 where they filled up like one like you're smoking now with
Yeah.
the good stuff, and I was like knocked out for like 2 days. I was like, I don't know how you like they just like literally like just hollowed it out and just like dumped all the shit in there. I was like, it was like I was like this it's like as big as a hand. I was like, this is
Yeah, you can get
insane. Like
nick
I've
sick if
never
you haven't smoked before and you just start puffing a cigar and yeah.
yeah. Yeah, but I've never really fucked with like the cigars for like the actual purposes that they're meant for or whatever. Maybe when I
Yeah.
get older or whatever. There was like a couple like special occasion type things or whatever, but um, I feel like having young kids now would be hard for me to really. I mean, even the nighttime excursions with the what have you or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
Right, right.
but so that's a like I said, it's cool, just another culture. So
And the
but
intersection is cool too. Like this guy Joshua Coburn, you actually mentioned earlier, he was the guy that I wrote about who lived in Iowa, rural Iowa in the '90s, and was
mhm.
really kind of ostracized for having tattoos and piercing, and had a suicidal moment, and then turned away from that, and thought to himself like, if I could take responsibility for ending my life, why the fuck can't I take responsibility for living my life? He became a motivational speaker, old hardcore punk guy, and he now also owns Dissident Cigars, a very popular brand. His wife Sin too, and she's all tatted up or whatever. She's kind of punk chick too, and so it's cool seeing like the punk aesthetic attitude also now blending into cigar culture. I'm like, fucking perfect, works for me.
So us talking about like different groups of people kind of brings me back to another question that Greg had written down, and I just want to mention too for people that are listening, Greg, who usually runs the podcast with me, is a director of a library. He's been a librarian for years, so kind of a bum that he's not here for this because he would have had many
Yeah,
many
it's just
many
great.
questions on his end, obviously, and but the thing you were talking about, we were talking about like diverse people and different cultures and stuff, and in the book, it seems like you have it could appeal to all sorts of different people, whether it be hardcore and punk, self improvement, people stuck in all sorts of bad places. But I guess what I'm getting at, what Greg wanted to know, is like, who do you think could benefit most from these groups, or is it like a number of them?
Yeah, right. So I mean, the subtitle is entrepreneurs, creatives, and authentics. Authentics is the most broad out of that because that could be anybody, right? That's trying to be authentic, and I think that's the key, right? Whether you're a creative or an entrepreneur or not, like I go through these kind of concepts in the book. One which I mentioned before, the internal spirit voice, hearing that voice. If that voice is listened to, I believe that you'll be able to kind of most identify your unique, um, skills or talents. And if you chase after them in earnest, I think you'll most align with what is your true calling journey. And if those three things are connecting, your internal spirit voice, and then following that into your calling journey, I think then that's when you're really most connected to your most authentic manifestation in the world. So, you know, that can happen for anybody, entrepreneur or not, creative or not. So I think the idea of how failure falls into that and how it needs to be premeditatively, thought about, because you're going to confront more of it when you actually are chasing difficult things and doing unorthodox things, or trying to like maximize your talents in the world. So I think it really can be for anybody because, like you said, nobody wants to talk about their failures. The title itself is fucking bold. Failure rules, because it does. You want to avoid it, yes, for sure. But if you're doing difficult, bold things and you're living properly in this unsafe world and you're not being a safety file and clinging to safety all the time unnecessarily, then yeah, you're going to have more failure. But there's so much that you can gain from it, and it really is part of the road to success. I mean, like Ryan Holiday said in his book, the obstacle is the way. What obstructs the way becomes the way. From the Stoic philosophy, and that's a fucking reality, man. And that's the crux of failure rules.
And it's funny too because I think from like 2012 till maybe like 2017, I played like daily fantasy sports like semi-professionally. Like I didn't really work. That's pretty much all I did. And I
Wow.
would have some nights and weeks where I did really well, but then there'd be weeks where I did really horribly. And like the first year or two, like my girlfriend is walking around upstairs right now. She probably is hearing me say this, like remembering all this. Like if I lost any contest, like lost money the first year or two, I would be like screaming, like, what the fuck, blah, blah, blah. But now it's like I still play, but not as regularly because I have kids and stuff. But there'll be nights where I'll win or not win, but like do well. And then maybe the next night I might end up like one of the very worst possible rosters, like somebody got hurt or just some player just didn't do very well. And now I'm
Yeah.
just kind of like laughing about it, like, oh man, like how horrible, how far down can I finish in one night type thing. Like it's like you learn to accept defeat and just
Yeah.
kind of work at it the next day and not you can't
Right.
like be pissed off about one failure because
Yeah.
that's gonna
Yes.
you know what I mean. So I think that kind of ties into what you're saying. And another thing you were kind of getting, I feel like you were talking about before, kind of goes back to the last question that Greg had. You weren't directly referencing this, but you were kind of talking about like some spiritual stuff. And I'm kicking myself because Greg had some of the best questions for this episode. I don't know why I didn't think of this because the movie Blow, George Young's dad says several times in the movie, and he quotes it, "Money is not real, George." And I've always kind of
Remember
looked at
that.
like life like that. You know what I mean? And this is kind of what Greg, I feel like, is asking about something that you talk about in the book, that money is a spiritual thing. So can you kind of talk about that a little bit for people that either haven't read the book yet or aren't exactly sure what you're talking about with that?
Yeah, it's failure rule number three is money is spiritual. It's the idea that like if you're straying away from the failure edge territories of envy and greed, which I view as malevolent twin siblings, they're two manifestations of the same spirit. If you stay away from envy and greed, those failure spaces, and you use money properly, because in essence it's an agnostic tool. It's not really real. It's what we make of it. But its potential is highly spiritual in the sense that money, when used correctly in transactions, really is it's us placing our value to measure our thankfulness for a service or a good, or in the other direction, receiving it. And I found that when money is viewed properly, it's not something to be worshipped. It's not something to be reviled. It's something to be used to really help us in this world, to help those we love. It can be a great tool to lift people out of poverty, a great tool to bless others, and be a force multiplier of love and thankfulness. And that attitude has always served me. When I was literally on food stamps. I could have been brewing with envy. Instead, I networked with high net worth individuals and entrepreneurs, and found a way to get them to give me their time and their trust, and sometimes even their money for ideas, because ideas are the true currency, and talent and trust is the true currency. And it was that spirit that, through money, really allowed me to lift out of poverty and into flourishing. And as a banker now, obviously, I take that mentality with me to the corporate boardroom.
Well, yeah, I would think that being a banker, you would look at money a little, maybe slightly differently than we do, but I think we've covered the book pretty well. Is there anything? I mean, I'm sure we could dive into it more. Like I said, I'm still like probably 2/3 of the way through, so I'll probably hit you up with some life questions maybe in a week or two.
Sure.
But as far as like the book conversation goes, is there anything that we didn't really dive into that you'd want to like explain to people that, or like, you know what I mean, talk about with the book or anything?
I mean, there's so much I could talk about. I would just say, like, just going through the rules of failure. Failure rule number 5: you are not your failures. I think is probably the most powerful one. It's just the idea that you should, like you said, a failure happens. It's just an event, right? It doesn't mean that tomorrow you can't pick up and resketch your life. So detach from the optics of failure, decouple your identity from your failure events. Know that even in like really bad ethical failures, even though you might face consequences or messiness, you can detach your reputation and identity from them and move forward and reinvent. There's always a fresh blank page to find at the end of the day to resketch your life. And so I think that's probably one of the highest messages of the book.
I'm guessing you probably have plans to write more books in the future. So I'm guessing we'll probably have another discussion in a at some point, and anything we missed as far as like, because I could ask you like probably a million questions about running a record label, and as I get ready to start doing whether I call it enterprise again or something else, I'm sure I'll probably be reaching out to people that I know that have kind of gone through this path, especially people like you who have stopped and started labels again, like I'm trying to do. You know what I mean? I feel like you would have more knowledge. But regardless of that, kind of getting ready to start wrapping things up, I guess, with the interview. Like, is there anything else that overall we didn't touch on that you'd want to touch on, or anything like that?
I don't think so. In terms of like pointing people to find stuff I'm doing. Again, the book is Failure Rules, the 5 Rules of Failure for Entrepreneurs, Creatives, and Authentics. You can find me at andrewthorpking.com, no E on the end of Thorp. From there, you can get into my Instagram at Andrew Thorp King, where I'm the most active. Also, YouTube at Andrew Thorp King. Great produced videos there that echo the themes of the book and bring them alive in a different way. There's also a free Failure Rules mini course you can get on the website, and get you also on the email list. And I got a kick-ass merchandise company that I started along with the book called Soul on Fire Supply Company that echoes the themes of the book. Lots of awesome designs, designed by Pete McAfee, who did the artwork for Dropkick Murphys Social Distortion. Also some designs by Craig Holloway, who's done work for like Wisdom of Chains, Agnostic Front. He did the whole cigar line, the Soul on Fire Smokeware line. So some really cool merch there to check out. And the soundtrack, Spotify and Apple Music, Failure Rule soundtrack. Go check that out. Playlist.
It sounds like you got all my last question is usually any shout outs or plugs. It sounds like you pretty much got all the plugs in. I'm going to, like I told you before, I'm going to make sure we put everything in the show notes for you too. We're trying to be better with that, with putting links in and stuff like that. Yeah. Like sometimes I hate going to a podcast and having it be like 10 pages long with like the information and the links. So now I try to make the bio a little bit shorter and the links in there too. So, but I guess with that being said, any other shout outs or anything else before we wrap it up?
No, I think we're good, man. I appreciate you having me on. That was a great conversation. It's cool to talk to somebody who has some of the shared history there. I know Mike Gayton. Love that guy. I haven't talked to him in years other than some Instagram messages, but looks like he's doing well. But yeah, some of those old memories, it's cool to connect on that. So it was great to talk to you.
The Hardcore Archive podcast is Josh Lyons and Greg Benoit with creative support from Rob Antonucci.
This podcast is a product of the Rochester Hardcore community. Theme song provided by Stand Fast.
Visit Hardcore Archive Podcast on Linktree to listen to past episodes.
Follow Hardcore Archive Podcast and Enterprise Hardcore Podcast on Instagram for updates.
If you have an idea for an episode or would like to have your band's music featured during the closing credits, please contact us at hardcorearchivepodcast@gmail.com.